Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. I'm really excited to bring you today's video. If you enjoy my content, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Let's get started. In 1998, in one of the quiet neighborhoods of Vienna, the capital of Austria, 10-year-old Natasha Kampusch set off on a regular morning to go to school. While a child's daily life in the safe and orderly streets of Vienna was expected to be trouble-free, Natasha's journey that morning would turn into the most terrifying moment of her life. At that moment, Natasha was dreaming of spending an ordinary day at school with her friends. However, unfortunately, nothing went as planned. In one of the northern districts of Vienna, shortly after Natasha left her house, 35-year-old Wolfgang Priklopil took notice of her. Priklopil had made a plan that morning. He saw Natasha walking down the street just like every other day, heading to school, and at that moment, he decided to seize the opportunity. Wolfgang Priklopil was following Natasha with his eyes for the first time that morning. His plan was simple but frightening. He would block her path, approach her, and quickly abduct her. He was cautious and calculated while driving, making sure no one would view him with suspicion. Priklopil arrived in a modern and ordinary car, getting close to Natasha without her noticing. Priklopil's car slowly approached Natasha. At first, Natasha thought nothing of it, assuming it was just a passing car. However, within a few seconds it got so close that he suddenly opened the door and pulled her inside. He quickly shut the door and started the car despite Natasha's screams. As the car sped off, Natasha's cries echoed through the streets, but no one came to help. Everything happened so fast, and Natasha was abducted in an instant. Natasha's fear, tears, and screams were met with Priklopil's coldness. As the car sped along, Natasha desperately tried to make sense of what was happening. Within a few minutes, she was being driven out of Vienna's outskirts. Natasha tried every way she could to escape the car, but Priklopil was always one step ahead. After a while, Natasha's desperation only increased her fear. Priklopil was taking her somewhere, making sure to leave no trace to avoid being recognized. At that moment, Natasha's mind was filled with questions and terror. She didn't know anyone. When she left her house that morning to go to school, she had never imagined that something like this would happen. She couldn't even dream that she could become a captive in such a short time. At that moment, Natasha only had one thought. Where am I being taken? After a while, Priklopil drove Natasha to a secluded house in the woods, similar to an abandoned mansion. This house would become the darkest place in Natasha's life. For a moment, Natasha believed all of this was a nightmare, but the reality was painfully true. Wolfgang Priklopil locked Natasha in the basement of the house. That moment marked the change of Natasha's freedom and life. This was a place completely isolated from the outside world, away from any human interaction. Natasha was completely cut off from the world. At first, Priklopil yelled at her, trying to scare her. Natasha was trapped both emotionally and physically in a state of captivity. Her mind was overwhelmed with fear, anxiety, uncertainty, and guilt. At that moment, there was only one thing on her mind: to escape. Priklopil did everything he could to prevent Natasha's family from reaching her. Natasha's family immediately contacted the police when they realized she was missing. Search efforts began at an incredible speed. The Austrian police put in great effort to find Natasha, but they couldn't track down any clues leading to the missing girl. After all, Priklopil was very careful, and no one suspected the truth behind Natasha's disappearance. While her family searched for her every day with hope, Natasha tried to understand every move Priklopil made while locked in the basement. With each passing day, Natasha's body and mind began to bear permanent scars. These traumas would shape her personality and mind. The years of captivity would deeply change Natasha. From that day on, nothing was ever the same for Natasha. It marked the beginning of an 8-year-long sentence. That moment was the last time 10-year-old Natasha experienced freedom. After Natasha Kampusch's abduction, Wolfgang Priklopil took her to the basement of an isolated house in the outskirts of Vienna, where he began keeping her captive. From that moment on, Natasha's freedom ended and her life was completely changed. The last thing she saw with her eyes were the streets outside her house and the suddenly vanished world. There was no returning to the street, to school, or to her family. Nothing would ever come back. Natasha was now a prisoner. Priklopil had taken every precaution to maintain complete control over Natasha. At first, he adopted a harsh approach to physically restrain her, locking the door to the room and forbidding her from leaving. In the dark room she was trapped in, Natasha was like a bird locked in a cage, a prisoner of her own thoughts and fears. The dark, silent, and oppressive atmosphere grew more isolating with each passing day. Priklopil allowed Natasha to leave the room only at certain times, usually for short periods. These brief visits to the outside world were enough to sever any connection she had left to the outside. Being taken to the garden or placed in Priklopil's car reminded her of what freedom had once been. However, these brief moments of freedom would soon come to an end. Natasha was forced to return to her room each time. Priklopil became even stricter with her, keeping her under constant surveillance and continually coming up with new ways to prevent her from escaping. At first, Natasha didn't realize how closely Priklopil was watching her, but over time she began to sense the presence of a watchful eye on her every move. Priklopil was always observing her. Every step she took, every sound she made, every movement was closely monitored. All this surveillance weakened Natasha, both physically and psychologically. She was exhausted physically, but the greatest pain was in her mind. Her own body felt foreign to her. Her freedom had become a distant memory and her future was uncertain. As days, weeks, and months passed, Natasha's physical and psychological condition deteriorated. The feeling of being trapped in her mind merged with the physical exhaustion in her body. In the beginning, the constant commands from Priklopil seemed like a form of authority, but soon she began to realize that this life, devoid of freedom and respect for humanity, was harming her more with each passing day. Yet any resistance she showed only led to Priklopil becoming more severe. Every day, Priklopil looked at Natasha with a cold gaze, causing her not only physical pain but also psychological suffering. She didn't see herself as someone who was valued or cared for by anyone. She felt like she was nothing more than a toy for Priklopil. In the beginning, she thought of her beloved family and friends, dreaming of returning to them and somehow escaping. But as each day passed, these dreams faded, and reality became even more brutal. Priklopil continuously subjected Natasha to a form of training. He used various psychological manipulations to ensure complete loyalty from her and control over her surroundings. Any disobedience or objection was met with punishment. Natasha's captivity was surrounded not only by physical boundaries, but also by mental and emotional ones. She began to forget what freedom and safety meant. For her, it was like a loss of consciousness. She remembered herself as a once free child, but that child seemed to have almost vanished. During this time, she experienced a deep confusion about what emotional bonds, especially love and trust, truly meant. Occasionally, Priklopil would take Natasha for walks in the garden, providing her with brief moments of change and a reminder of another side of life. However, after these short moments, Natasha was always sent back to the dark, cold room. After a while, these rare moments of freedom became reminders of her darkest moments. During this process, although Natasha's body physically weakened, something was beginning to shift in her mind. There was no real hope of escape, but she began to discover the resilience of the human psyche. Although she remained in constant fear and distrust, the hope of escaping and gaining her freedom was always there. However, achieving this freedom depended entirely on Natasha's inner strength. In this period where captivity became harder each day, and she regressed both physically and mentally, it was almost impossible not to see a glimmer of hope. Yet, she realized one thing. No matter how much this process tested her physical and emotional limits, the instinct to survive and everything human kept her alive in some way. One day she developed a deep belief that she would somehow escape this nightmare. This period became one where Natasha's survival instinct endured even under the harshest conditions. Natasha Kampusch was just 10 years old when Wolfgang Priklopil abducted her And as a young child, she had a limited understanding of a person's physical and psychological resilience. In the early days, all she felt were emotions of helplessness, fear, and panic. Not knowing what would happen, she cried frequently and prayed to return to her family, but nothing worked. The idea of being mentally strong during that time seemed far and unattainable. Preclopil's psychological pressures seriously threatened Natasha's mental health. In addition to physical pressure and threats, Preclopil cleverly used psychological manipulation to push Natasha into an even more difficult situation. Natasha constantly felt like she was playing some sort of game. Preclopil never left her alone and frequently applied various tactics to mentally wear her down, attempting to break her psychologically. Each encounter, each meeting slowly wore her down, isolating her emotionally even further. At first, it was possible to say that Natasha, being just a child, still held on to the dream of returning to her family. However, as time passed, the constant pressure from Preclopil made her start to erase the thought that she could truly escape and regain her freedom. With each passing day, the feeling of hopelessness grew stronger. Preclopil's goal was to dominate her not just physically, but mentally as well. Being kept in a room far from home, in a place no one knew, meant that almost everything about her life was controlled. She slowly became a stranger to herself, detached from her former life. In the early years, Natasha struggled frequently with depression and feelings of being lost. Each day, she fought an internal battle, yearning to return to a world she once knew. However, the psychological blow from captivity also awakened her survival instinct. She had to do something to survive, to find a way to escape. Her situation was so severe that the moments she spent alone with Preclopil during the long days became the greatest mental struggles. During these times, Preclopil worked harder to break her down and manipulate her. Natasha began to better understand how dangerous and ruthless the person in front of her could be, instead of simply seeing him as a threat. Being alone made her more vulnerable to Preclopil's mental pressures. Every conversation, every interaction turned into a form of psychological torture for Natasha. Preclopil, in a way, was applying mental torture, constantly playing psychological games with her to break her even further. Over time, Natasha's inner strength and desire to survive grew. In moments when she felt helpless, alone, and trapped, she became mentally stronger. She developed the ability to cope not only with physical challenges but also with emotional and mental difficulties. Most of the time, she would create escape plans in her mind, strategizing on how to achieve freedom, and she survived through these thoughts. The passing days only strengthened her survival instincts, making her even more determined. Being mentally strong became Natasha's only way to survive. She developed a form of resistance against Preclopil's pressures. However, it was difficult to say how challenging this resistance was, because with each passing year, Natasha's sense of freedom and hope began to fade from her mind. This made her colder, more detached, and more vulnerable. In a process where captivity strengthened both her survival instinct and her sense of imprisonment, Natasha was forced to make an incredibly difficult choice. The strategies she developed to resist the pressures imposed on her brought her one step closer to freedom each day. She could take small steps forward, testing whether she was strong enough to resist Preclopil's pressures. However, with each step she took, she was also trying to protect herself from Preclopil's manipulations and emotional pressures. During this process, Natasha's subconscious began to shape the techniques and strategies she would use to survive. Each new day became an opportunity for her to test her strategies and hope. As part of her mental battle, Natasha eventually began to create a real roadmap for her freedom. Even though she still dreamed of escaping every day, there was no turning back. There was only one way, and that was the path to freedom. Even though she still felt like a child and a young girl, each passing year taught her to possess the strength of a woman. The survival instinct not only helped Natasha physically but also emotionally and psychologically. Indeed, her victory in the psychological battle gave her the courage she needed to reach her freedom. Mentally stronger, Natasha began preparing her strategic steps for escape. Both her body and mind were now ready to fight for freedom. August 23, 2006 would be one of the turning points in Natasha Kampusch's life. For the 8 years prior to that day, Natasha had questioned her life more and more with each passing day, living each moment as though it were a prison. In the basement, where she was held by Wolfgang Priklopil, Natasha had often fallen into despair, never having stepped outside even once. However, towards the end of that terrifying captivity, an opportunity had arisen for Natasha. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment that everything could change. Unexpectedly, Priklopil had allowed Natasha to stay home alone for a few days. This was a complete surprise to Natasha, because Priklopil constantly controlled her every move and never allowed her to step outside. When Natasha found herself alone in the house, a wave of fear and excitement washed over her, shaking both her body and mind. This moment, which she had waited for so long, could truly be an opportunity. Although the idea of going outside seemed frightening and dangerous at first, a deep inner instinct whispered to her that she needed to seize this opportunity. Those few hours alone at home were when Natasha's survival instincts were awakened most strongly. However, to make use of this opportunity, she had to carefully think through each step. She knew everything had to be planned and done secretly before Priklopil returned. Natasha mulled over the idea of going outside in her mind, several times weighing the steps she needed to take. But one thing was certain. If she missed this chance, she might never have another one like it again. At that moment, when Priklopil was not at home, it was the perfect time for Natasha to get outside. Her first step, once alone in the house, was to silently open the door and step outside. After such a long time, taking this step required immense courage. The possibility of Priklopil returning at any moment was a constant threat. But Natasha knew she must not miss this chance. After a few minutes of mental preparation, Natasha slowly cracked the door open. Her heart raced as she carefully took each step. She knew that stepping outside meant turning the dream she had harbored for years into reality. But she only had a few minutes to seize this opportunity. Leaving the house meant facing the risk that everything could go wrong with every step. The possibility of Priklopil returning at any moment sent a chill down her spine. But no matter what, she decided to step outside. When she opened the door carefully, the cool air outside hit her face. In that moment, she was just a few steps away from the freedom she had long desired. Seeing the outside world, even if just for a few seconds, and catching a glimpse of the normal world she had imagined for so long, gave her the courage she needed. She quickly scanned her surroundings to make sure no one was watching, then quickened her steps, leaving the house behind. She was heading into the outside world, a world she hadn't set foot in for years. In that moment, it felt like everything in the world belonged to her. Her heart raced with excitement, but at the same time, the rising sense of fear threatened to suffocate her. But this was an opportunity that Natasha could not afford to miss if she wanted to claim her freedom. As she stepped outside, she felt stronger and more independent than ever before. The surroundings were familiar, yet after years of isolation, the world appeared completely different. Her eyes were open to things she had been deprived of for so long. Everything looked different and new to her, but the biggest challenge was figuring out where she could go in this world on her own. At that moment, she had successfully stepped outside the house she had been trapped in for years, but she didn't know what to do next or who to contact. Would Priklopil return? How much time did she have? These questions echoed in Natasha's mind. After spending a few minutes outside, she slowly decided to return to the house. However, even that brief moment spent outside was a great victory for Natasha. She had finally taken a breath of freedom after the most difficult moments of her captivity. Achieving this gave her courage and confidence. For Natasha, that moment represented not just a physical escape, but also a spiritual renewal. The outside world was still foreign to her, but at least now she realized that it was no longer just a dream. That brief escape gave her hope and showed her how close the road to freedom really was. August 23, 2006, marked a turning point in Natasha Kampusch's life. After years of horrifying captivity, she had finally taken the first step toward her freedom. However, escaping was not going to be easy. Natasha had struggled to gather the courage for her freedom and had fought the greatest mental battle of her life. But now she had one opportunity, and she had made the decision to seize it. Stepping outside meant taking the greatest risk after years of fear and disappointment. When Natasha stepped out of the house, her body was still weak and exhausted from years of captivity. However, mentally, the survival instinct within her was strong. As she carefully took each step in the garden, her heart raced. She didn't exactly know what to do or where to go, but one thing was certain. This was an escape route from the nightmare that had lasted for years. After a brief hesitation, Natasha found herself beyond the garden, on the street. She quickly looked around, frightened by the people she couldn't recognize, and hurriedly took more steps. In her mind, she had a goal. She needed to find a safe place first. She was trying to rediscover the world she hadn't seen for years. At that moment, the entire outside world was foreign to her. But one thing was clear. This world could now be hers. Years of isolation had left her physically weak, but the courage within her gave her hope with each step. As Natasha stepped from the garden into the streets, her heart began to race faster. She was now walking in a world where everyone could see her. Hoping to find a safe place, she quickened her steps, trembling with fear at the beginning of her escape. As she walked outside, everything around her felt new, as if it had never existed before. The sounds, the colors, the people, everything was unfamiliar to her, but also seemed like signs, guiding her toward the right path. Fortunately, Natasha's luck was on her side. At that moment, a house door was open, and Natasha quickly headed toward it. Hiding in a stranger's house, she felt both physically and mentally weighed down by fear. But there was no other way. Entering, securing her safety, gave her the hope of saving her life. Her heart raced wildly as she approached the door. The door was slightly ajar, and there were people inside. She knocked on the door, slowly but firmly. The people in the house were shocked when they saw Natasha. Perhaps at first glance, the fear and pain in her eyes said it all. At that moment, they realized that the years of terror Natasha had lived through had left visible marks on her body. But the most important thing in that moment was that these people had to make the right decision. They needed to help Natasha. The homeowners immediately called the police. For them, the sudden appearance of a young foreign girl at their door was strange. But without hesitation, they reported it to the authorities. This decision became the first step that saved Natasha's life. At that moment, she realized that everything was unfolding quickly. It was a step towards the freedom she had dreamed of for hours and even years. The police arrived swiftly and took Natasha to safety. For the first time, she saw that people were there to help her, away from her fears. This was truly a moment of liberation for Natasha. In that instant, after years of captivity, it marked the beginning of her life starting anew. Natasha's escape was not just a physical escape, but also a mental and spiritual liberation. After years of fear and pressure, she had entered a world where courage and hope took root. She had been freed from a great mental and emotional burden. However, this was just the beginning. Because even after gaining her freedom, Natasha had to cope with the trauma and losses she had experienced. But at that moment, everything had changed. And this would never allow Natasha's life to be the same as before. It was no longer just an escape. It now symbolized liberation and rebirth. Natasha Kampusch's escape created a worldwide stir. The media reported her survival after years of captivity and her journey to freedom as big news. However, this massive media attention made it difficult for Natasha to live the life she desired. While people admired her story, all eyes were on her. Being viewed as a hero of freedom won her the attention and admiration of society. But for Natasha, this became a heavy burden. After her escape, one of the first challenges Natasha faced was constantly seeing herself through others' eyes. Cameras, microphones, and journalists didn't leave her alone. There was so much to tell, but Natasha, after all the trauma and the pursuit of freedom, was yearning for some solitude and peace. Being the center of media attention began to feel like a set of shackles for her. While she lived her dream of freedom, she also carried deep emotional burdens she couldn't share with anyone. In the early days, it was completely normal for Natasha to be in a state of shock and confusion. After years of captivity, she had forgotten how to live her life and what the normal flow of life felt like. While for many people, her life might have seemed like it had truly started again, for her, this process was often the struggle of someone waking up from a nightmare and trying to hold on to life. At this point, receiving psychological support was crucial for her. Natasha had to deal with a lengthy therapy process. The therapy process was extremely challenging for Natasha. The traumas she had endured since the moment she was kidnapped had put an immense psychological strain on her. Suicidal thoughts, depression, and coping with losses, along with the process of rediscovering her freedom, were incredibly complex. At first, people found it difficult to understand the depth of Natasha's pain, because from the outside, she appeared to be simply a survivor. But the fractures inside her were much deeper. Overcoming the traumas she experienced and her struggles with freedom and identity would take years. On top of this, Natasha also suffered from physical effects caused by the years she spent in captivity. Due to lack of proper nutrition, exercise, and a normal lifestyle, her physical health took a long time to recover. This period was one of the most challenging moments of Natasha's daily life. While continuing her therapy, her physical healing process began alongside it. Many therapists and experts believed that her survival and ability to hold on to life again was nothing short of a miracle. After Miraculous kidnapped Natasha and held her captive for years, the truth about him coming to light was another important moment in her life. When Miraculous realized the police were on the way right after her escape, he tried to flee in fear. However, before he could be caught, he committed suicide. His death caused Natasha complex emotions. The man who she had constantly feared, who had kept her under pressure and control, had finally ended his own life. And while this brought her some relief, for Natasha, everything had a price. This meant that her freedom was not only about escaping, but also about the end of the trauma she had endured for so many years. Natasha's rescue not only symbolized her strength and resilience to live, but also inspired a global understanding of the survival struggle. Her story became one of the strongest examples of how physical and psychological limits could be overcome with human willpower. Survival required not only physical strength, but also a psychological battle. Natasha's slow journey to recover and regain a normal life gave her a new identity and freedom. Over time, Natasha became known as the miracle of survival among the public. As people learned about what she had gone through, they admired her strength, resilience, and willpower. However, Natasha frequently stated that she did not aim to inspire others. She was simply a person who had struggled to survive, felt the pains of captivity deeply, and had regained her freedom. Contrary to what many people thought, Natasha had to leave her old identity behind and start life anew. Coming to terms with her past and reshaping her future was extremely difficult for her. But with every step she took to rebuild her life, she grew stronger. She tried to rebuild relationships with her family and began taking small yet important steps toward finding herself. Slowly, she discovered her true identity and regained the freedom she had lost for so many years. Natasha's story became an unforgettable example of the power of human will and the strength of the desire to survive. Her journey continued even after her captivity ended, because survival was just the beginning. The healing of the trauma a person experiences is not only a physical journey, but also a mental one. This long process laid the foundation for Natasha's ability to hold on to life again. Over time, Natasha managed to bring balance back into her life. Free from the shadow of captivity, she tried to accept herself and her past. Even though she found a new identity and freedom in her current life, she always remembered what it meant to survive, and now she looks to the future with more hope. Natasha Kampusch's story was not just a fight for survival. It was also about discovering one's own power and being reborn.